Welcome to all our panelists and attendees. We at MicroSave Consulting are very honored to host you all for this webinar. And we hope to have a very insightful conversation today, hoping to make it very interactive here. So the format goes, we'll start with opening remarks by Dr. Pawan Bakshi, which will be followed by a presentation by the MSc team. I'll hand over the mic to Graham then. We'll start with a panel discussion, which will be followed by Q&A. And post that, we'll have the concluding remarks. So a message to all the attendees over there, if you have any questions or comments, please post it on the chat box. We'll be happy to answer them. And we will get in touch with you if we haven't answered your questions during the discussion. So before I start, I will take this opportunity to introduce Pawan, who will be delivering the opening remarks. So while I was writing about Pawan, I mean, anything I was putting on paper was seeming very reductive because the words were not doing justice to what he has achieved. But still, I'll try. So Pawan is the India country lead for FSP at Gates Foundation. FSP is the Financial Services for the Poor. So he and his team focuses on running and providing efficiently and delivering digital financial services to the poor and creating innovative models that can be scalable across the nations. One very important point about Pawan has been that he has co-created India's first mobile wallet service. Yes, Airtel Money, and later incubated the track for providing Airtel Money services to the poor. So with that note of appreciation, I will hand over the mic to Pawan to deliver the opening remarks. Over to you, Pawan, now.
Thank you, Prajita. You've been really kind. It seems that, I've achieved, I haven't, it's all teamwork, and everybody over here and in the audience are part of that. So thanks so much, and the appreciation is for them. So in terms of what we plan to do here today is talk about, can G2P actually help unlock women's economic empowerment, right? So let me give you a little bit of a background on G2P and why we thought it was a good idea to do this. G2P, as you know, is not really a new phenomena. It's been there for ages. Ever since most of developing countries need to support their most vulnerable populations, which include women, and they've been supporting this by transferring cash. What India did very differently, in the last about a decade, is that they started to introduce technology into this entire ecosystem, and which meant that the actual transfer of cash moved from a physical cash transfer to a digital transfer in the bank account of the beneficiary. Now, that's a really important aspect of this, is because just imagine that the scale which India does this work on is that it transfers annually about $93 billion to about 800 to 900 people across the country every year. And to do this, the administrative cost of delivering cash was really, really high. Right, and so I think that it took that out of the way. It took out beneficiaries who would duplicate. It started to remove other inefficiencies in the ecosystem, and in the last about a decade or so, it has delivered more than $300 billion in this pipe, which covers about 2,200 to 300 schemes, both across the central and the state governments. Now, having gone and said that, most of the programs, as since it's called the welfare and subsidy program, are meant for the most vulnerable populations. And I'm not too sure if it's by design or by chance, but most of the recipients of those programs are women, right? Whether you take the cooking gas subsidy, or do you take food delivery, or do you take some specific programs meant for nutrition and other and child support? They largely go to women. And and the fact is that what we've seen in India is, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, that there is a digital divide between men and women in terms of how they use the digital technologies, and how it impacts the ecosystem. Having gone and said that, what we also realized is that we hadn't studied in detail what the impact of these G2P flows were on the women and their families. I think that was really important to understand. Why? Because most of the people and institutions were working extremely hard for the last couple of years to ensure that the basic railroads on which the G2P is delivered worked fine, and removed inefficiencies and other barriers from delivery of the services. So it was really important to understand why we were doing this, right? And the fact that the teams in India were able to remove a large amount of barriers and create this ecosystem also helped during COVID, when about 200 million people, specifically, I'm sorry, it's not people, it's women, who received about $5 in their bank accounts within few weeks of announcing the lockdown. And there was a very strict lockdown. And that helped a lot of women manage their households in rural areas, where, I mean, it's not easy to understand for most of us that what does a $5 mean for a rural poor household. But let me assure you that it does impact what they can do with it for their families and their children. The other is that the issue is that how, since there are a large number of people impacted by G2P, it became very difficult to understand what's happening across the country in various districts. So there was discussion with MSC to see what is the right number of people that we should be talking to get the feedback. I was glad that we could come up with a nationally representative number, which is around 5,000 surveys across 12 states, which is large enough to understand that. And actually, I will not steal the thunder from the presentation which Aprajita and the other team members are going to make soon on how people responded back to those incentives and those and the feedbacks. But I think the important thing to highlight is that a very small percentage of women felt that there was either hardly a very small impact or no impact at all of DBT on their lives. So I think that's a huge learning for us, saying that that the G2P/DBT really works, right? And obviously it's not the end of the inquiry or of the hypothesis, but I think it's the beginning of the story to see how else to improve it further. And the reason why I talk about that there's a need to improve it further is because there is a very serious lack of data in terms of it being, it disaggregated in terms of gender, to actually know what and how people utilize various systems. So unless that is the core of this, that we need to really understand that it's not very easy to get the data on number of bank accounts owned by women, or number of mobile phones owned by the women, or the number of digital transactions done by women, and spread across urban and rural areas, and across various other segments of women. So I think that's really important, is because once we have that, I think the most governments around the world will be able to then make very specific gender intentional and gender transformational policies which could catalyze action. I think there's more research which is needed to move us ahead in that direction. But I'm really glad that we have already started on the journey, and we are talking about this at a global level. And I wish the discussions all the best as they continue from here. I'll be very keenly listening to ideas and thoughts of the other speakers and the questions which will emerge from the other audiences to understand what else could be done to catalyze action in the area. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pass it back to Prajita. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Pawan. It has been, your remarks have been very insightful, and thank you so much for talking about DBT, which is actually considered a logistical marvel in India, and also for introducing our study, talking about gender disaggregated data. I think we'll hear a lot from Diva on that. So I think we will have a poll up right now for all the attendees, and I'll request you not to Google it, but just put in your ideas. We want to hear what you think. So meanwhile, I'm pulling up the presentation. Is my screen visible?
Yes. Yes.
Sure. Yes. Sure. So yes, so we have been talking about G2P or government to people payments for quite some time, as Pawan has already highlighted. So we have talked about it in context of reducing leakages or administrative burden, or reducing rent seeking, addressing inclusion, exclusion errors. So these, or doing it efficiently. So there have been these parameters which we wanted to address. Now, what happened was March 2020 happened. We are amidst the COVID pandemic. Now, what happens is, one side, on the one hand, you have people who are struggling for their everyday's requirement, which needs the government to act very with a lot of agility. And on the other hand, you have the government which is working with a very constrained capacity, because it is handling the pandemic as well as transferring welfare. So what happens here is G2P becomes the litmus test of how well government is doing welfare payments. So as Pawan already pointed out, India has done marvelously well in that sense. But overall, also in other countries, we saw that the G2P coverage actually doubled during this time, and almost 38% of the population was getting covered by that. We also saw the government were paying around, on an average, 1.5% of the GDP was being transferred through G2P payments. And for some countries, it was as high as 27%. So this is just to set the context of how beneficial, how much has been the transfer over the years. Now, MSc was very interested in understanding that this amount is being funneled through government schemes, and how is it impacting women specifically, because they were one of the most affected by COVID, because COVID had gendered effect. So what we did was we studied G2P schemes across Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and Kenya. And for example, in Indonesia, we studied a health and education scheme. In Bangladesh, we studied an education subsidy program. Across India, we did a study of 7 DBT schemes, which were 2 of them were concentrated on women itself. And then in Kenya, there was a study on a G2P umbrella scheme, which covered basically women, disabled, orphans. So what we found from these collaborative studies was overwhelming majority of women felt very positively about DBT. So they were saying it is either helping in their education expenses, healthcare expenses, or household expenses. So there was a pattern we saw across countries here, where women as high as 94% were saying that it has helped their children in in staying at schools, or has increased their attendance. So this was there. But I mean, something very interesting happened in September this year when the goalkeepers report came out, and Melinda Gates said that she has the money, but can she use it? So I think that was a question we had tried to gauge in our study. Like, is this money increasing her financial and non-financial decision making? So we found that yes, it does increase her decision making, maybe not completely, but significantly. So we found that women were saying that they could make decisions around that G2P payment either alone or with their husbands, or they thought that they could decide on how to spend the money, and they garnered more respect from the family because they had that money and decision making at place. So obviously that's there. I mean, they were able to make decisions, but does it mean that G2P was working flawlessly? Then I think that would be a mistake. So we found that there were a lot of challenges with respect to G2P. So now I would categorize these challenges in two terms. One would be, you can call universal challenges. The other would be unique challenges. So unique challenges are more like program delivery challenges, which are very specific to a program, maybe in the awareness or enrollment or during the delivery of a scheme, which we found across all the countries actually. And then there were specific universal challenges, many of which we have spoken about. Few of them were new to the cause. So there were challenges across financial skills and inclusion, which were present across countries. For example, access of a women to a withdrawal point was a constant challenge we saw women face. Maybe they have to stand in a line to get their money. That's a problem. The second thing we saw was there was a great impact of social norms. Now, you can see in the presentation, we are talking about mobility in terms of social norms. So what happened was we wanted to understand how many women in India can go out to bank, ATMs, and other public spaces. So we found that only 34% of the women have actually the freedom of mobility, that they can decide to go alone to these big places, which are considered very DBT relevant. Now, why is it important? It's important because while writing these G2P programs, while having the policy design, we assume that women have the same mobility, similar as men, or men and women are the same unit. So I think that's a fallacy there, and that has to be taken into account. Now, coming to social norms, there were obviously there were norms around mobility, spatial mobility, as we were talking about. That was a challenge, but it was not limited only to that. For example, we found across in India and Bangladesh that women have to take permission from male family members. They are often chaperoned by them. It so also happens that husband or the son is actually doing the withdrawal on their behalf. And if a woman, I mean, often sometimes they are coerced into giving away that G2P payment. And in our India study, we found that if they are not ready to give that money, a small percentage of them has to also go through violence. So I think we found that there are norms which are impacting how women are accessing G2P payments. But when we wanted to understand, are these norms omnipresent, and are they same across continents? So we found that even though there are norms relevant to geographies, but they're not all the norms are applicable somewhere. For example, in Inua Jamai, we found that women don't actually have to take that much, like only 5% women have to take permission. But we also found that almost 64% women are benefactors of Inua Jamai. And actually this program was flipped. Initially, it was only for household, it was targeted at households, but because men are the primary de facto heads. So it was flipped and converted into benefits for females. So there is a scheme where they have kind of tried to neutralize the this norms. So a key takeaway here is probably we have to do a global research to understand what are the norms which are applicable on women across these geographies, because we have found there are different norms which are applicable. And second, we have to also understand what kind of impact they have. For example, in Bangladesh, we found that mobility may be impacted really less, but there was norm around men being the household head, which impacted a lot. And probably this is where the government needs to step in. Now, taking from this, we thought, what are the key recommendations we are thinking of? So there were two very clear recommendations, and which is actually a no-brainer, and everybody has been talking about that. One is to enhance financial access and improve digital literacy. Now, coming to one which Pawan also talked about, the gender disaggregated data. So one has to understand what gender disaggregated data, I'll explain it. It's like collection and tabulation of data on the basis of gender. So we are saying both cis and transgender here. So men, women, transgender, all are considered. So why is it important? Is because, as you saw, different norms are applicable for different genders. They are not isolated unit. They can't be considered a unit. They have different things which are being driven. So you have to take up this data in order to inform policy decisions so that better policy can be created. I think we will take up this question with Diva also, who will be able to better give us an understanding of why it has become so critical for G2P policy. Just to give you a background, a UN Women report recently came out which said we need 22 years just to get gender disaggregated data for SDGs. So it's not about gender equality or anything. Just to get the data, you need 22 years. And by the way, we need 132 years to get gender equality, just to an FYI. Now, the other last recommendation which we were talking about is how norms are impacting G2P. So as I said, definitely we need to study how norms are impacting and what kind of percentage of difference they are making. Maybe they're impacting different across geographies. But why do we need to do that? So one is it helps you to make better policies. For example, in India, a lot of malnourishment program or about children, wasting or infants has been previously targeted only on the mother. But now the targets, the people whom the doctors are speaking to, or the ANMs and Anganwadi workers are speaking to, are also including the mother-in-law, who's a very important stakeholder in the family decision making. So I think to make a better G2P policy, you need to be very cognizant of the norms. That's the first thing. The second thing is why we need to study these norms is, finally, we use G2P programs to nudge the society towards a more equal society. For example, currently, a lot of malnourishment programs are focused only on mothers and children. I mean, fathers are also a very important factor here. So why are they being isolated? So I think knowing that we kind of consider that mother is the primary caregiver, we kind of isolate the father who wants to contribute but is not given that importance. So I think once we are cognizant of these norms, we'll be able to make policies which not only drive us towards better welfare outcomes, but also towards a more equitable society. So I hope I haven't bored you with all the details. So that's all of the presentation from my side. I'll hand over the mic to Graham, who will take up introducing the panelists and then with the panel discussion. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Aparajita, for running us through that data. Very helpful indeed. So now we come to the panel discussion. I'm really excited by this because we have a superstar lineup. And so in this discussion, we'll quickly delve into the impact of G2P payments on women and consider the challenges that they face, both in terms of government processes and indeed restrictive social norms. And I hope that we'll also have a chance to listen and learn about frontier innovations that can maximize the impact of G2P for women. So our stellar panel, introducing Sophie from the CGAP. She is the new CEO of CGAP, and it's a real honor and pleasure to have her with us today. Also, we have Diva Dar, the Deputy Director, Data and Evidence from the Women's Economic Empowerment Department or Vertical of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And she has been spearheading a lot of the work on gender disaggregated data. So a real honor to have her with us as well. Also, we have Alicia Hammond, the Gender and Digital Specialist at the World Bank, working with the ID for D, so Identity for Development program at the World Bank. And also we have with us Felicitas Namboya, who is the Senior Economic Inclusion Advisor and Gender Lead at FSD Kenya, which has done some really great work in Kenya. So let's just dive straight into the questions. You don't want to hear anything from me. And Sophie, what I'd like to learn from you is, we know that global evidence demonstrates that gender norms create barriers to women's mobility, their employment, financial decision-making, control and ownership of assets, and access to resources such as mobile phones and internet. Now, these barriers in many cases prevent women from accessing financial services at all. And you wrote in a recent blog that one of CGAP's call to action was to advance new partnerships beyond traditional financial inclusion stakeholders, specifically to address restrictive gender norms. How is CGAP setting about developing these partnerships, Sophie?
Thank you, Graham, and everybody. And first of all, I want to thank you for the research you conducted, which I think is extremely useful and brings a lot of new needed evidence. But to your questions, first, I'm going to start with the basics. Of course, as Aparajita mentioned, we do fully agree, and we have a lot of evidence that confirm that norms really matter, and that they, gender norms, and that they basically create an uneven playing field between men and women when it comes to accessing G2P services or financial services in general. Before I come to partnership, the very important question is, can norms change? Since we know that norms exist and are a problem, can norms change? And there we have partial evidence. We have, I think, implicit evidence. We know from the pandemic data simply that there has been a massive change in the opportunities for women to access G2P services or digital financial services in general, and your researchers confirms that. We don't know whether these represent changes in norms or not, but we imagine that it did. 80 million women opened their first digital account during the pandemic, whom probably would not have done that, partially maybe because of gender norms, if it wasn't for what the pandemic created. And so crisis modes actually may be one of the reasons why norms change. So we believe norms can change. And so then the question becomes, how do we make that happen so that women can access more financial services? So I think the first thing I'd like to say is really to echo what Aparajita said, which is the first step is to have more research to understand what these constraining norms are. But that is really difficult. I think it's, it requires a lot more thinking, because the norms that we're talking about are actually deeply rooted in culture. They're often private. They happen within the family, within the household, within the house. We don't even see them. They may be also very different across regions, sub-regions, communities, religious groups. So it's not like a country level diagnostic is the answer. It's much more difficult than that. And how do you get a diagnostic that's really gonna give you the complexity of the problems in an open manner. Another thing to realize is that, of course, the norms that are constraining go well beyond the financial sector. They go well beyond access to digital solution, access to assets, mobility. They're also about self-esteem, roles in society. So this is much more difficult to understand, measure, quantify, etc. I think the last point I'll add on the difficulty is that often the norms are owned by women. They're not just imposed by society on women. They have actually grown with these norms and they find them normal. So they don't always want the norms to change. So it's an additional difficulty, I think. So my first point is really that more research is needed, and that's where partnerships are required. As you know, CGAP, together with Market Share Associates, has developed a gender norm diagnostics. We are in the middle of implementing it, running it, together with a number of partners, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, UNCDF, IFR, FSDZ, I just don't want to forget anyone, GIZ, FAO, WFP, and IFAD, in a number of countries. But as I said, norms are not national. Norms differ by sub-regions, groups, etc. So this is totally insufficient. It's the beginning of something. What you did is also the beginning of that evidence building, but much more is needed. And that's the first area where partnerships are needed. We need other groups to help build that evidence in a very granular manner. I also really agree with what I think Aparajita again was saying about the need to have gender disaggregated data. That's the underpinning understanding of what the impact. But I think Diva will probably talk about that, so I will not. But that there too, partnerships are needed. The third area where partnerships are needed, I think, is in addressing the norms. So once you understand what the constraining norms are, of course, you need to address them. And because the norms are so related to such complex threats of cultural attitudes, behaviors, and preferences, etc. The partnerships are needed to address them because they need to be addressed from different angles. It is no longer often a financial sector issue. So you can't just work with financial sector or government G2P providers. You need to work with, as I think Aparajita said, women's empowerment advocacy groups or women associations, but you also need to work often with community leaders, with men, actually. They need to also understand, and we have a lot of examples where men have been involved, employers sometimes. But also, if you really want to change norms for the long term at scale, often ministries of education needs to be involved, because education is actually a very useful way to address norms for the long term, starting with how children think about themselves, or authorities at the highest level, looking at even public campaigns and changing the way society sees themselves through films and movies. I think what is important is to build on behavioral change economics, because that's ultimately what we want to do, is to change behavior. So there are examples we can leverage, such as about health, reproductive health, for instance, where there's a lot of success. I just want to give you a few examples. So CGAP has developed a technical guide to address norms, but it really is not easy. I want to talk about India a little bit, but not much, because it was already addressed by Pawan. But really, what's important to realize is that, for instance, India is a very good example of a country where the government has done so much to bring women into the financial sector, opening accounts, providing G2P services. It has actually also done a lot of work to change norms, for instance, through soap opera. That's one of the countries that tried to do that. And yet, if you look at usage of digital accounts after G2P transfers have been received by women, it's still very, very low compared to men. So have they really changed the norms? Probably not, despite all these efforts. So one example to show how difficult it is. On education, I wanted to talk about the Caribbean. I used to work in the Caribbean, and there they really, several countries try to change norms around women and especially violence against women, but more broadly about how women see themselves in society and how men see women in society through education. So from primary school all the way to high school, having programs, classes dedicated to that with some success. Another example, much more related to the financial sector, is the HER project that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation supported in Bangladesh with the Bangladesh Sustainable Business Network, where they decided to pay women digitally through transfers to women in digital accounts. But they realized that to be successful, they also needed to train women in many ways around digital financial skills, but also get their employers involved. So they trained employers on on gender issues, basically. And they also realized they needed to get the husbands involved. And so in that case, they gave letters to the women to give to their husband to explain why it was in their interest. And we see that the combination of this led to some success, but it's still mitigated. So women felt that they felt more empowered, they felt they had more decision-making power in how to manage the cash. But for instance, it's only, we only saw a 10% increase from a very low base in the number of women that reported that they did not have to hand their cash over to their husband in the family. So even with all of this in place, the improvement is slow and limited. So I'll just stop there to say norms can change. It requires understanding them, which is very complex, and it requires partnerships to address them from a wide variety of angles, including at the highest level sometimes in society. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and that's really a good summary of just how complicated shifting social norms is, and the sort of challenges that face us as we seek to do so. You mentioned the importance of gender disaggregated data, because ultimately that is what will drive decision making and policy and so on. And in that context, you've provided a perfect segue to the next question that is for Diva. Because we know that on the supply side, governments are starting to design gender intentional programs, but very often gender data, gender disaggregated data, is simply unavailable. And one wonders, in the absence of that data, how addressing the social norms is going to be possible. And as our Parajita said earlier, and I sort of did a double take when I first read this, UN Women recently reported that it will take 22 years to close SDG gender data gaps. 22 years. Are we really going to be that slow? Do we really have that time? I was staggered. So Diva, what are some of the current challenges around collecting gender disaggregated data, and what are the ways that we can close those gender gaps in the future?
No, thank you for this very important conversation around how data is going to be very important for women's economic empowerment, including for G2P. The first thing I wanted to reflect on was we have come a long way on gender data, though we have a long way to go still. So just, when the foundation started the work on gender data in 2016, about 1 in every 4 data points for SDG gender indicators were available. So only 26% of SDG gender indicators were actually available at the time. That number in 2022 has actually gone up to 51%. So there has been a near doubling, but the next half is much harder to get to. So, the sort of gains that were more low-hanging fruit have been reached, but in terms of building standards, supporting some of the surveys, helping sort of disaggregate existing data. But there really does need to be a committed, coordinated investment in data not just from national statistical offices who are often, or countries who are reporting this data, but from those who are evaluating programs, who are designing and thinking about programs, as well as from the private sector, who is an important player in this space as well. Even in terms of social protection, while we keep talking about transfers to women, how much data do we actually have? The World Bank, and Alicia might talk about this later as well, has an Aspire database, but only half the countries don't actually even collect data on who in the household receives cash transfers. And even for those who do, this is often not processed or reported, and the analysis is not available. So despite sort of all these conversations or discourse, the ultimate understanding of who is receiving that cash transfer is not necessarily easily available to look at. And it's great that the bank, in collaboration with the foundation, is working systematically to change that, not only in disaggregating data where it's available, but also providing guidance to countries on being able to collect that data more comprehensively. Coming to norms, which Sophie was talking about as well, and we know this is crucial. And India is one of the few countries where between the last 2 rounds of the World Values Survey, we've seen a decline in gender norms related to areas of women's work and economic empowerment. It's one of the few countries where that's happened. So most countries have shown progress, and India has been one of the few that that's taken a step back, which is obviously concerning given low labor force participation rates overall in the country. But there hasn't been anything since the pandemic because these data are not regularly collected. The next round of the World Values Survey will become available later this year, and I think is going to be an extremely valuable asset for many of us who are trying to understand the norms and attitudes that underpin economic empowerment and financial data. But just to say that while I'm talking about the problem, there are obviously a range of issues and solutions that need to go hand in hand as we think about it. One is just the lack of alignment or intentionality around gender. So one of the things that we see is the discourse on gender has increased. So voice and articulation of gender priorities from leaders, from advocates has really made a difference. But this is yet to sort of filter into a lot of the work around data as well as design. So, someone in your comments was commenting about, are we still just talking about, it's 2022, are we still talking about sex disaggregated data? Unfortunately, we are. Most countries are not reporting it or often don't think about it even when they have that data available. So intentionally collecting the data, but not just at the sort of superficial level of bank account ownership or access to this data, but really thinking about, as Aprajita was pointing out earlier, even the sort of intermediate steps around things like mobility, around norms, around preferences of women are going to be really important to help design policies and programs that are effective. The second one, which as a community that I think we need to work on, is when standards exist and they're increasingly getting filled and being developed globally by standard setting agencies such as the World Bank or ILO. When standards exist, it's extremely important that we as a community work to actually adopt them so that there is some standardization and some sort of alignment across the industry on how we, for example, define women's work, or we define access or digital inclusion. I think it's important that that kind of harmonization does occur across global surveys, but also in our individual studies and work. And then finally, the one thing that, despite all these great ideas, money talks, there is a lack of financing, right? So the gap currently is about $250 million every year for gender data. So if these goals are to be achieved, if we're to actually meet targets in terms of reporting the SDGs, there needs to be a significant commitment, not just from donors and multilaterals, but really from country governments to invest in this and not think of these as sort of add-ons or nice to haves, but must-haves to help achieve our development goals. So I think those are the sort of 3 takeaways from me in terms of next steps for the data.
Thanks so much, Diva. And I think you're, of course, absolutely right. The observation I would make also is that not only do governments need to invest in this, but also the private sector, because I think the private sector is missing a lot of opportunities because they are not collecting and analyzing gender disaggregated data. So let me turn to Alicia and ask her for a quick overview of what the World Bank is doing in order to seek to advance women's economic empowerment in the context of G2P. Alicia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Graham, and thanks for the kind introduction. So one quick correction, so I am with the ID4D team. It's our sister initiative, but I actually lead women's economic empowerment for the G2PX initiative. So a lot more focused on what we have here today. So lots of different hats, but thank you for that. So I'll start by explaining a little bit about the initiative and what we do, which is supported by the Gates Foundation. So it's great to see colleagues from the World Bank and also Diva together today. So what we do is we're a cross-sectoral effort that was launched in early 2020. And the goal is really to leverage the process of digitization of government-to-person payments in ways that accelerate really key development outcomes, including financial inclusion, but of course, women's economic empowerment. So what does this mean in practice? I'll highlight the 3 ways in which we go about this work. So the first is through enhancing global knowledge through research and analysis. And I'll give a recent example, which I'm excited about, and I'll drop in the chat. But this is about also developing a shared vision of what an inclusive digital G2P framework looks like. So we've highlighted a range of design principles, for example, using secure and scalable systems built on shared infrastructure, looking at facilitating access to transaction accounts where access points and connectivity can ensure the convenient access to funds for recipients, thinking about issues like choice of payment service provider and payment instruments, and a range of others. So really using that global knowledge to try and build consensus in this space as governments move towards digitizing these processes. And with respect to women's economic empowerment in particular, this means a few different things on the research side. First is mapping the evidence. So what do we actually know about what is working at the intersection of digital payments and women's economic empowerment? The second is identifying good practices. So these might be approaches that haven't necessarily been through an impact evaluation, but based on what we're seeing in practice, they hold promise. And then the third is thinking about measurement. So I'm really excited that we're talking so much about sex disaggregated data here today, because one of the things we've been working on with an initiative at the World Bank focused on measurement in this area is how do we actually develop an innovative and multidimensional framework for measuring women's economic empowerment in the context of G2P programs at the country level. And I can share a bit more about that later. So I mentioned 3 approaches. The first, like I mentioned, is about the global knowledge and research. The second is about country action. So we are active in about 40 countries. And so this means gathering data at the country level, looking at issues like the barriers that women face throughout the payment process. I was really excited to see the presentation because there's a lot of alignment there. But when we're thinking about women's economic empowerment in particular, we look at a lot of things. So asset ownership around mobile phone ownership, for instance, economic participation, food security, which is an important part of we for us in a broader context, financial autonomy and decision-making, access to social and collective networks. And so I'm happy to share that in the chat with our colleagues as well, with our participants. So in addition to collecting that data, what we also do is work and partner with the government as they embark on the process of implementation of digitizing their G2P architecture. And then thirdly, we use the opportunity to, because we have the benefit of scale and a lot of different country action, to really use this platform to facilitate knowledge exchange and bring all the stakeholders together. So first, this has been meaning bringing the technical teams together so they can learn from each other and their different country experiences based on where everybody is in the process of digitization. But as we scale and grow, we really want to have the same kind of mechanism where we're bringing governments together as well in a much more systematic way. And then just the last point I'll make is, as we think about how do we share knowledge on women's economic empowerment in particular, I think it's key for us to be specific and to go deep. So one of the areas that we talk a lot about, or looking at the research and bringing the expertise together around, is on digital financial capability. And what does this mean in practice? And what are the approaches that we can test and scale, and what's actually working? Another is on social norms. I think that's very key. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but just to highlight a really poignant study from the DRC, some colleagues of mine did at the Gender Innovation Lab, and it was exactly about norms. And the short takeaway was, despite a lot of the interventions, men were not willing to give up power. And so it's really an interesting question for us about, how do we actually get this social change in motion? How do we support women's groups who are doing this from the ground up? And how do we make sure it's sustainable? Because it's indeed a tricky issue. And the last thing I want to share is just about innovative digital financial services products. How do you actually tailor these products to make sure that they're meeting women's needs and maximizing their empowerment where we can? So that's kind of a big picture about how we work, but happy to talk about design approaches in more detail in the next session.
Great, thank you so much, Alicia. And a couple of observations that jump out to me immediately around digital capability. It's a sort of obsession of ours here at MSC. And because I really worry that we'll wind up with bifurcated societies, with one set of people benefiting from the digital revolution and all the information and knowledge and access that it provides, and the other set across the other side of the digital divide, missing out on those opportunities, getting poorer and more isolated. And digital capability is a real problem, and doubly so for populations that are oral, i.e. they don't read or are not functionally numerate. And I hope that as we progress, we will look at the role of intermediaries to help those types of people participate in the benefits of the digital revolution. Let me turn to Felicitas now, because if there's one country that is ahead of most when it comes to at least mobile money, it is, of course, Kenya. And Felicitas, your work at FST Kenya has demonstrated that much of the growth in financial inclusion in that country has come from women's uptake of mobile phones and mobile money. But the gender gap on the use of the internet and all the benefits that it offers remains. So I think only 35% of women use the internet compared to 54% of men. What are the constraining factors that deplete the use of internet services in Kenya by women?
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, it's true that Kenya has made significant progress in financial inclusion, mainly driven by mobile money or use of DFS, but that use has been basic, as you indicate. And so, whereas the financial inclusion gap is only the financial inclusion gender gap is only 4%, when it comes to usage of DFS beyond just receiving and sending money, the gap is almost 20% between men and women, of course, in favor of men. And that stands out. And when you start to look at who uses mobile money for what, we realize that we still largely a cash-based economy with less than 1% using purely non-cash instruments to transact, and the gap or the proportion of those who use a cash only to transact is quite significant. We're still at 18.3% of Kenyans using purely cash for their transactions, and the demographic that's typified by that is mainly women, and women in the rural areas, and specifically younger women, those between the the ages of 18 to 25 years, and older women above 55 years. And one starts to wonder what's common among those women. And when we start to look into the factors that pose a constraint in relation to use of DFS and internet generally, there's certain things stand out that disadvantage women compared to men. And one of them is just the inability to afford the internet enabled devices such as smartphones and internet or data in itself. And when we start to look into why women compared to men, then it gets us back to the social norms and other things that make it not possible for women to generate as much income as men. And such include fewer employment opportunities or income generating opportunities. And those could relate to lower education attainment. They could also relate to time poverty, because women do not have as much time to invest into income generation as is the case with men. And that brings to mind a survey we did among the youth, especially during COVID. And one thing that typified them was the women was that they put in less time than the men. And whereas there wasn't a clear difference between what they'll generate in an hour or so when it comes to how much the women were investing in their micro businesses. It was clear that the men were putting in much more. And also the time of generating the income differed between the young men and the young women. For instance, the women needed to go to close shop earlier than the men to attend to domestic work and other care work. And so that disadvantaged them compared to the male youth. And so there are subtle things which make a difference in relation to the income that women generate compared to men, and those have a knock-on effect on whether they are able to afford the internet-connected devices or the data that they need to use DFS or internet generally. The other key factor is a limited general and digital literacy and numeracy, as has been mentioned. Due to the limited education, inevitably the women will have less ability to use products that are digital. And the other factors that stand out, especially from work that we've done, like the gendered financial product survey that we carried out in 2021, is the fact that women learn about the existence of certain products from avenues that are dissimilar to the ones that men use. For instance, we heard from micro entrepreneurs, informal micro entrepreneurs, or female retailers, that they learn about financial services from either family or friends. And so if the avenue used for advertising digital solutions is the TV or other bits, they might hear about them, but they might not trust them. They like to hear from those close to them to be able to trust those solutions and to use them. And beyond just the hearing, then they need to build the confidence to be able to test those solutions. In work that we did deal with Karibu, I believe partially funded by Gates, or leveraging work that had been funded by Gates in around 2019, what we gathered was that yes, women, given their limited income, they shy to try new solutions. And that was cited as a big factor when it comes to use of DFS, because to them, once money is lost, it's lost. And quite a number said they would prefer to go all out to transact in cash, or to withdraw the money from a bank account and take it to someone and pay in cash, because they didn't feel that they were covered sufficiently to be able to get redress in case something went wrong. But at the same time, they were comfortable using those they trusted, the same family, friends, or the same agents who are near them, with whom they build trust over time to undertake DFS. So those particular aspects tend to set women apart. And at times, you know that accessibility can be a limitation, especially when it comes to the ability by the agent who is closest to the woman to effect certain transactions. And that could relate to the transaction size. So when that happens, then the woman becomes limited in that they would have to go the extra mile physically to transact. And that might not be a possibility, because more often than not, either due to the unpaid care work or restrictions or social restrictions related to mobility, they're not able to go that far to make those transactions happen. So those are just but a few of the factors that constrain women or could be constraining women's use of DFS. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Felicitas. It's all, of course, a series of interrelated and immensely complex factors, as you say. Now, we have some really, really interesting and provocative questions coming through. So I'm going to be a bit naughty because we're slightly behind schedule. I'm going to ask panelists to be as succinct as they can the next couple of questions, because I'd like to make sure that we get to the questions from those kind enough to be our audience. So Sophie, let me turn to you as succinctly as you can, please. Women, like most beneficiaries, prefer to have choices, both in terms of access and where to withdraw G2P funds. But how can G2P choice architecture circumvent or navigate or indeed perhaps even leverage the social norms that we've discussed?
Thanks, Graham. I'll be as quick as I can. So I want to refer to a study that CGAP has just concluded with G2PX. So that's the initiative that Alicia mentioned, and the World Bank, which is precisely on G2P choices. And of course, it's very logical. The main conclusion is that if a recipient have choices, they can have a better experience with G2P, and that leads to a better impact. I won't develop that. I want to focus on women. This is particularly the case for women because indeed of the existence of gender, of norms and constraints to women's access to financial services. And in particular, those that are mostly addressed, at least partially through GDP choices, are the fact that women have many demands, what is called the time poverty, right? They have many demands on their time. They need to take care of many things in the household with the children, and therefore they don't have necessarily the same time as men to go out and cash their transfer. Women also have lower mobility. In many places, women have, as Felicia mentioned, lower digital and financial literacy. That in turn affects their trust in financial services and their trust in themselves in moving to a financial institution and cashing out their transfers. They also, unfortunately, and we have evidence of that both through our own data, but also Findex, they're more likely than men to be mistreated or subject to frauds and abuses. For instance, just the fees that they are likely to be charged by the intermediary are more than for men likely to be raised, etc., etc. So G2P choices, when it means the ability to choose from which financial intermediary or from which agent you can cash out your transfer, really helps address many of these constraints. And what's important to realize is that it's a self-reinforcing mechanism, because what it does is also changes in effect the incentives for the provider of the cash transfer transfer to the recipient, because suddenly their goal becomes gaining the loyalty of the recipient. And of course, this is even more the case if the recipient has the ability to switch accounts. So it's a further choice characteristic that's very important. We also see that G2P choices reduces leakages, including corruption, discrimination, and fraud. And because, of course, a woman or any G2P recipient is less likely to choose an agent who charges unofficial fees. I'm not going to describe an example in the interest of time, but the one very good one you can look at separately is the Zambia's Girls Education, Women's Empowerment and Livelihoods Project, which is a G2P project where government transfer were sent and beneficiaries had the ability to choose between 6 different financial services providers. It was also accompanied by ancillary services to ensure the women were empowered to make those choices, and where you can see indeed from the feedback from the women that it did help them in terms of their mobility, their time management, but also avoiding discriminatory treatment and feeling more respected in the process. I think the main lessons is that when government design a G2P payment program, they need to integrate a gender lens from the very start. They need to understand what are the barriers, so the norms and other barriers that affect the ability of a woman to benefit from the transfer. And they need to design not only the transfer mechanism, but also the ancillary services around them, including, you know, the agent network regulations, etc., so that the system as a whole, the architecture of the system, addresses these norms and barrier. And of course, in that context, choice is absolutely fundamental. I think I've demonstrated that. You know, the conclusion is that when women can choose where, when, from whom, and how they receive their funds, their gains are amplified. So I'll stop here in the interest of time. There's a lot of evidence on that, and the report from G2P, CGAP, and the World Bank is great. It's a great read.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Yeah, no, absolutely. And there are, you know, very small things that make a huge difference. For example, in India, we've seen that if women are told that they have to cash out at the local Kiko agent, and that Kiko agent is also running the local store, very often women have you know, credit balances sitting with that storekeeper, and if they don't have the choice and have to cash out there, there's a very real risk that they will be given that money net of the amount that they owe to that storekeeper. So let me turn to Diva and talk briefly about the data collection, which often is a routine top-down approach and is therefore static in terms of timelines. You know, there's a baseline, a midline, an endline, or whatever. And by comparison, use data, therefore, and as a consequence, data quite often sits on the shelf. How can we incorporate more dynamic data partnerships in this context of G2P? Diva.
No, thanks, Graham. And, you know, sort of taking off from where we left off last time, I think there are a number of innovative partnerships that can happen, right? So I think there's no longer a need to just sort of have impact evaluations where we do baselines and endlines and have to wait a couple, 2 to 3 years for results, but really, you know, have partnerships that are much more embedded. So to give you an example of some of the projects that we are engaged in, you know, really working with MCOPA, for example, connecting them to researchers to actually do some testing, you know, first more rapid feasibility testing or around how to make their low-cost smartphones more accessible, more user-friendly, have products that can help enable women for their livelihoods as well, layered into their low-cost smartphones in Kenya. And then have that work tested more rigorously for scale as well. So I do think there are different kinds of collaborations and partnerships. CGAP is working, for example, very closely with the financial sector. So with regulators, with financial service providers, to not only do this kind of baseline endline, but, you know, the more impact evaluation data, but really work on supply side data. understand structures, incentives, and capacity and expertise to improve sex disaggregated data on not just account ownership or transaction data, but really things like access to credit, terms of loans, of repayment, a whole host of other financial history for women that should be taken into account by private sector providers, as we were discussing, to think about the women's market, to actually think about how to solve for their challenges and their access and points and barriers. So I do think there are innovative ways that we need to move forward as a community, in addition to longer term impact evaluations and work on longer term horizons, which is key. It's been key to showing that women increase their labor supply when they receive money in their accounts. They make higher profits, they work more in the market, they work more in the private sector. We know that there's a range of benefits that come out from impact evaluations, and I think thinking about other interesting partnerships and arrangements to take this work forward will be key as well in the future.
Great, thank you so much, Diva, and 2 extra brownie points for being so wonderfully succinct. Thank you so much. Felicitas, let me turn quickly to you. As I noted earlier, your work at FSTK has demonstrated how inclusive finance can help increase resilience amongst Kenyans. What lessons can governments take from Kenya on incorporating innovative financial products to deliver G2P funds?
Yeah, thanks. Without having to repeat what Sophie and Diva have already said, I think building an infrastructure that provides a choice is a good starting point, because that alone can ensure that those targeted are able to access the cash transfers and to do meaningful things to help enhance their resilience. In Northern Kenya, for instance, we know of cases where beneficiaries go for even more than a year without collecting a cash transfer, where the access points are not close, the cash out points are not close enough to them. So choice is a starting point, and having innovative ways of making that cashing out happen. And so from the Kenya experience, when in 2018, the various G2P programs were integrated or brought under the national safety net program, that formed the starting point of making that happen. And contrary to what was happening before, where the various programs had a single payments provider, then the government reached out and identified or procured 3 financial service providers for making that happen, and to incentivize them to get into zones that might not have been attractive for them to reach. Then they did zoning, and they did alongside that tiered pricing, and that was quite helpful, and it made a difference in the ability of those targeted to reach the cash out points and to collect their transfers or their cash transfers regularly. And in addition to that, then we're looking forward. We're far from there, and it was interesting to hear Sophie talking about what's happening in Zambia. We look forward to a time when we'll be able to have an infrastructure that effectively makes that choice happen, because thus far, and I don't know whether to blame it on COVID or just the slow pace of making things happen within government, but thus far we've not had the choice bit happening. The beneficiaries are still locked to the providers that they selected. And for Kenya, the bigger complication has been the fact that the biometrics education has been a key factor, and there wasn't a standardized way of collecting the biometrics. So transferring those from one provider to the other, I guess, has been the more trickier bit, because if one needed to change a provider, then they would need, or to switch accounts from one provider to the other, the new provider would have to go through that all over again. And so there are lessons to learn from elsewhere where things could be happening more effectively. And I think the greatest opportunity that Kenya has is leveraging the mobile money or digital financial services infrastructure. And the one reason that was left out or was not considered in procuring the four that are currently providing the choice in relation to where one can have accounts was the fact that they didn't have the biometrics authentication factor. And I don't know whether that's something that can be, that the MNOs can get to provide in future, or how else one could work around that, because for sure in Kenya, digital is what has made the biggest difference in relation to financial inclusion. And that's the one thing that G2P is not as yet leveraging it, or at least not effectively, because even those who have their accounts, not many know that they can map or tie their bank accounts to their mobile money accounts and be able to withdraw through the mobile money accounts without necessarily having to go to a bank, a branch, or a bank agent.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Felista. So, yes, of course, that absolutely makes sense to me. So, Alicia, totally unfair to ask you to respond to this quickly, but nonetheless, fairness has never been one of my things, of course. How can we tailor G2P programs in the future to maximize their positive impact for women? You know, where have we made progress already, and what are the big challenges?
Thanks, Graham. No, I love this question. It's something we've been thinking about for a long time, but I'll try and do it in 1 minute to honor your request. So let's see if we can do it. So based on the evidence that I mentioned and good practices that we've looked at, we've distilled this into 10 key design principles. I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you some quick highlights. Of course, directing payments to women in their own fully functional accounts in their own names is key. Second, thinking about accessing digital technologies, mobile phones, SIM cards. But I work in digital development global practice, and you know, it's really key that we do this in a way that doesn't distort the local market. So thinking about financing, thinking about direct subsidies, making sure people have a choice that they'll keep those cell phones. So having the broader infrastructure in play. Digital financial capability, we talk about a lot, but we haven't gone into what we mean specifically. You know, hands-on training, something that is potentially in a pair setting where women can learn from other role models, build their self-efficacy. Maybe some nudges, edutainment approaches. I would say we need more impact evaluations, but maybe that's my bias speaking, Diva. I think we would love to have more evidence there. Tailored DFS solutions. I always love the IDEO.org Budapest example of the roving agent model, collecting a bunch of requests from communities and then bringing the agent to women, reducing how much time they have to travel, saving them time, reducing risk of gender-based violence. I think innovations like that are really, really key. How do we think about accompanying measures that came up? So this is something we know from the social protection literature more broadly, but if we're serious about women's economic empowerment, we also have to think about business skills and how we actually improve women's access to assets overall. Engaging men and the wider community to shift norms. We have a great webinar on our website. I encourage everyone to check out from the experts in this space. You don't always have to tackle a norm. You could circumvent it, you could create a new norm. And so what's really key, what's exciting, one of our countries in one of our teams in Liberia is working on is a joint financial planning exercise between couples as an intervention that goes along with a G2P payment to see if this reduces the risk of gender-based violence and increases women's decision-making. So thinking about how do we actually incorporate nudges like that as a way to tackle social norms. And then lastly, I would just say women's safety and security is really key. we talk a lot about agents, but how do we actually make sure that agents have their own codes of conduct, that we have ways of reporting issues and acting on them if something does happen, so that we can make sure that we keep women safe in this broader ecosystem. So we've been thinking about this, lots of ideas. That might have been too much for 1 minute, but yeah, stay tuned and we'll have some more resources out to share shortly.
Great, thank you so much, Alicia, and also 2 extra special brownie points to you for being so succinct on such an enormous topic. Absolutely hear you on several of these issues. Rather than me pontificate on a couple of them that are dear to my heart, let me turn to the questions, because our audience have given some great questions. Let's start with one for Sophie, and if any of the other panelists want to chip in, please just let us know. So Sophie, one directed to you. Social norms are often deeply entrenched and take decades to undo. However, can policymakers undertake interventions to make some of these norms shift in the short term? What type of interventions might these be?
So I would build on what Alicia just said, and really building also on the evidence that Findex has given us. Because for me, there are some low-hanging fruits in many countries, and so maybe also a proof of concept that has been provided to us by the pandemic experience. And so I think the few things that really matter, they may not always be sufficient, but I think we know now that they really make a difference, are the following. I'll cite probably just 3. One is the digitization of payments, not just G2P payments, obviously, but also all sorts of payments that women receive or make. There are still many countries where government's payment, agriculture payments, and many women obviously work in agriculture, or utility payments, so payments made by women or people to utility institutions, are still made predominantly in cash. And we know that once payments are digitalized, you start in a way weaving in women in a digital financial world, and it's not always leading to the use of digital financial services on a recurring basis by the person, but we know that it is one of the key incentives. So, and there are still countries, Egypt, Cambodia, the Philippines even, where the majority of payments are still in cash. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is, again, Alicia mentioned it, the Kiko infrastructure, the agent infrastructure. Because even if you can weave women into a digital world through digitalizing payments, they live mostly still in many places in a cash economy. And so the ability to cash in, cash out their transfers is absolutely fundamental. But as we discussed throughout this seminar, there's still a lot of issues with agents, issues of trust, issues of distances, issues of abuses. And so developing an effective, trustworthy agent network is fundamental, and having it, of course, digitized. The third element is consumer protection, in my view. We haven't discussed it much today, but one of the key enabler of greater, women's financial inclusion is simply trust in the system, trust in a digital world, trust in financial institutions. And that's really not easy to build, but consumer protection is a sine qua non. It's a precondition, if you want. And women need to be protected more than men because they're more susceptible to be the subject of abuses. And so I would definitely recommend that governments think about strengthening their consumer protection systems as a low-hanging fruit in that respect. I'll stop here.
Excellent. And in the context of agent networks, I would perhaps add that we've got to, in many countries, grow women agents, the networks of women agents. And there's a direct mapping between the countries where we have problems with gender issues and lack of women agents. So Pakistan has almost no women agents. Bangladesh has very few. India has like 10 to 12% of agents are women. And this is, in my mind, absolutely crucial. both Diva and Alicia are jumping in on this. Let me start with Diva because her hand was up first, and then we'll come to Alicia.
I know you want to get to other questions, so I'll be super quick on this. But you know, I do think it's important to realize that even giving phones to women or giving money to their accounts does liberalize some gender norms. So there are already gains by just doing these interventions themselves. But that's obviously only takes us sort of half the way, and there's a lot that remains to be addressed. The good part is we have evidence from India itself and other countries that interventions around school curriculum, around school-based gender awareness campaigns, again, evaluated through rigorous RCTs, are showing promising signs of changing gender attitudes, not only among women, but also among men and their communities. So girls' clubs, role models, a host of other interventions, some of which are actually being scaled up by the government, you know, in various states, whether it's Punjab or Odisha, in collaboration with organizations like JPAL, are actually, you know, promising. So I think there are ways to ensure that you're changing gender norms. And then the second one is ensuring that some of these lessons about how norms are constraining women make us, even in economic programming, create components of programs that are either directly changing norms or are norms aware. So we're not worsening or mitigating risks to women along the lines of what you find in the report of being some of the sort of under adverse consequences that women may face. So NRLM is also doing more in India on norms-based programming. So I think there are some interesting ideas and spaces which I'd love to hear more on what Alicia has to say and if there's a broader discussion with this group.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Diva. Alicia.
Thank you so much. I'll be super quick. So one point and a couple examples. So I just wanted to make the point that, you know, as we think about social norms, we really need to work with the experts in this space. Financial sector folks are not norms and experts in social behavioral change. Same for social protection. And I think we run a risk of potential backlash. So just to highlight that, you know, where we can actually incorporate these experts into our various programs, I think this is really, really key. And then second, I wanted to just highlight some examples from the webinar that we had on exactly how we go about changing social norms. The first point is, you know, assessing the norms correctly. So what people think are the norms are not always the norms, and making sure we have those measurements correctly. People tend to overestimate how conservative a lot of their networks are. So I think that's really key. Looking at the norms across various levels. So whether it's at the community level, at the policy level, at the individual level. So really having a multi-phase approach. Having safe spaces for reflection, of course, is key. Thinking about these norms. Looking at ways to confront power imbalances are also important. And I mentioned, you know, creating new norms. Like maybe it's not about tackling and taking the risk of, you know, changing a really entrenched norm, but maybe creating a new positive norm with role models. So just to highlight a couple of those key solutions that came up during one of our webinars. Thanks, Graham.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to be very naughty. We have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to try and squeeze one last question in. And the question is as follows. We often talk about gender disaggregated data as just getting women and men data separated. Is that a good way of looking at it? What does gender disaggregated data, how does it add value to designing G2P policy? Maybe Diva, you could start us off on that.
Yeah, no, you know, I realize we're still talking about gender or sex disaggregated data often. And the reason for doing that is that a lot of people still don't do it. It sounds very basic, but it's, you know, it's still not happening in so many, whether it's financial sector data, whether it's health data, whether it's poverty or feminization of poverty, we just don't get access to that. And it's not just about men and women and genders, it's really about, or for them, it's about ensuring that A, this is being fed to policymakers, but B, we're looking more holistically at women and men's lives, right? So it's not just about disaggregation. Gender data is really looking at women's constraints and opportunities more holistically, whether it's on financial inclusion or digital inclusion, or other aspects of their life. So we don't need necessarily, for example, care work. Like you wouldn't normally think about that, but those are things that constrain women from financial inclusion. So thinking about things like mental health, care work, things that affect women disproportionately is also going to be important. And I will end on that note.
Perfect. Perfect. Oh, Sophie.
I just want to respond a bit more directly to your question. I actually think that it's high time for us who influence how government think about G2P and gender data to embrace a non-binary vision of gender disaggregated data. So I think CGAP, we are going to go into this, and it matters not only because that's a reflection of society, but also because there is slim, but there is evidence that there is also discrimination in terms of access to financial services by non-binary gender recipients. And so I think this is a very important area for all of us to work on going forward. Just wanted to add that.
Super. Thank you very, very much indeed. And I'm hoping that Alicia's just put some great resources into the chat. And I hope that both the decks, the India one and the one that started this webinar are also in the chat by now. You can find the latter on our website and the former on the World Bank website. Let me, on behalf of everyone who's joined us, thank our stellar panel. I really appreciate your time. I know you're all immensely busy, and to take time out and answer my impertinent questions is very generous of you, and really appreciate it.